equity for a little bit, equity in tiny houses. And it's so funny talking to a few people, but here we are. It's going to be a good conversation. I am part of a group called Equity Solutions. There's 6 of us who make up this team, and we represent across the class spectrum, from generational poverty to owning class wealth and everything in between. And we have a variety of different work experiences, and we've come together as a team, and we provide workshops and trainings, consulting on equity, looking at poverty and economic inequality and how it's impacting our lives and the work that we do. So we work with organizations, with schools, with businesses, all different groups, to add a lens of equity and how we can address poverty and economic inequality using an equity lens. So we were asked by the Tiny House Fest to come and do a workshop on class equity and tiny houses. And it's really interesting to look at the tiny house movement with a class equity lens. And we spent a bunch of time doing research. Ourselves, we don't have tiny houses, although we're paying attention to the tiny house movement. And we really began to think about this concept of voluntary simplicity, which is in many ways what the tiny house movement is doing, is asking people who have plenty to voluntarily live simply. And we're thinking about that compared to mandatory simplicity or poverty, where people have to live simply. And when we think about the reality of this country and this world, the majority of people live simply. They have to. There's no other option, right? And so when we're looking at class equity in the tiny house movement, we're really thinking about how do people who are voluntarily living simply, holding hands with people who are mandatorily living simply, and together working for equity and eventually liberation. So what we did at this workshop yesterday, we spent about 6 hours with 25 people. It was a wonderful group of people. There's a few people here right now that were at the workshop yesterday, and we took time to look at the U.S. economic system, to do some models of that, and then to build tiny houses with unequal resources, and then to apply the learning that we had from those exercises to how are we going to begin to think about class equity in the tiny house movement. And what I want to say, when I say class equity in the tiny house movement, I am thinking of the fact that not everybody has access. That the reality is, when we look at who's building tiny houses, there are people who have 42,000, an average of 42,000 of income a year, and that's not the majority of Americans. And so, how can we expand who is building tiny houses, who has access to this amazing potential for shifting what the reality is of the housing, of the housing market right now in the U.S., which is very unequal, right? We have, when I talk about that, for example, in Vermont, we're the 47th state in the country for affordable housing. For every 100 affordable housing units that are needed, there's only 50 available. And so we have a crisis. We need affordable housing. Tiny houses provide this amazing option for affordable housing, and yet not everybody can access tiny houses for a variety of reasons. So we want to expand who has access to tiny houses. There have been some amazing conversations today under this tent talking about how do we how do we get more people involved? How do we hear from people who are most impacted? And that is true for the tiny house movement. How are people who are most impacted by this housing crisis at the table making decisions about what's happening for tiny house design and land, location, and making it accessible to more people. So let's see, let me look at my notes here. Yesterday, in the workshop, we really went deeper with 5 questions. And I'm going to focus on 2 of them, but I want to read these 5 questions so you hear what we are talking about. One is, how do we organize to change regulations that negatively impact tiny houses? So tiny houses need to have more viability in the housing market right now, and there was a lot of good ideas about that. People love to talk about that. How do we form cooperatives and work towards community-based visions for housing? There were a lot of folks yesterday at the workshop who had and are working on great ideas for cooperative housing. How do we create open source information and resources for everyone to access? This is great. There's so many great designs, and also people working for changing regulations. So how do we get that information out on the web so that more people can access that information? And the 2 questions I want to focus on right now are, how do we creatively finance tiny houses so that everyone who wants one can access one? And how do we increase representation and decision-making power for everyone? So the reason I want to focus on these is because these are really looking at how do we expand who is in the tiny house conversation and actually living in tiny houses. So we came up with, we had these big sheets of paper, and there are all these ideas. So it was a really creative group of people. A few ideas to highlight for creatively financing tiny houses. One is that we're using town-owned public land to put tiny houses. A great idea. Using creative loan funds, community financing options for housing. There was someone at the workshop who was coming from Western Mass, working with Habitat for Humanity, talking about communities pooling their resources, coming together and putting in $50, $100, and then that money being shared with one family who then is able to build a house, and then continuing to share the wealth in that way. Along the same lines, mutual aid networks, so that communities are supporting each other, that this isn't about private funding or privately held capital, but that it's about community held capital as we think about tiny houses. And another one is organizations providing the upfront costs or also funds to match sweat equity, and then that people are renting to own, so that organizations who have access to more capital are able to put together tiny house projects. This is already happening. We had a presentation yesterday from Alexis Stevens from Tiny House, not Tiny House Nation, Tiny Living Expedition, thank you. And she shared with us 6 or 7 examples across the country: Kansas, Florida, North Carolina, Oregon, Colorado, all of these different projects where organizations are working to build tiny houses. They're putting the effort in, the money in up front, and then people who are homeless, people who are low income, who are struggling with mental health issues, are then having this opportunity for housing. And those are amazing projects. One of the questions that came up for us as we're thinking about equity in those projects is, are the people who are benefiting from those projects, are their voices at the table from the very beginning of that project? Do they have decision-making power when thinking about the design, the placement, the financing, all of those things, so that it is really a community-owned project instead of a social service a charity project. We also, when we're thinking about these kinds of projects, it's really crucial. Well, the next question gets at this: how are we increasing representation and decision-making power for everyone? One of the ideas here was that if a space is inequitable, we refuse to participate. There's a person who participated in the workshop yesterday who said when she's going to tiny house workshops, conferences, meetings, she is making sure that whoever is at the front is very diverse. People of color, women, people who are over 60, people with differently abled and speaking different languages. There's a diversity of people who are talking about tiny houses, who are involved in really shaping how this movement moves forward. And so that brings up a point. When we were talking yesterday and we're talking about equity, and we're talking about class equity, we can't talk about class equity without talking about race. Historical and current day policies, institutions that benefit people with white skin and hurt people with black and brown skin. And we have to take that into account when we look at housing today and making sure that we're not recreating those policies that harm folks of color. Another thing there was to actively seek to understand others' obstacles to participation. And one of the things that we did yesterday to get at this is to tell our own stories. In the room, we're telling our own stories about housing and our own barriers to access. We're hearing from people who have lived in all different kinds of living situations. Some people who have been forced to live in tiny spaces and are not going to be living in a tiny house anytime soon because of trauma associated with housing. And so thinking about that as we move forward, that tiny houses aren't necessarily for everyone is really important. And another idea that came out of the group is make sure that community-based initiatives are done with resident participation from day one, which is what I talked about a little bit ago. So those are some of the great ideas that came out to think about class equity in tiny houses. And one of the main takeaways from the day and from this looking at class equity in tiny houses is that if we are really going to take this amazing tiny house movement and make it the change that it can be, it is essential that people working on tiny houses are joining hands with people that are looking at housing justice and affordable housing of all kinds, joining together to think about housing as a human right and working together to make that happen. That this isn't just about tiny houses. It's about all of us working together to change a system that is really unequal. There are a few people in the space right now that were at the workshop yesterday, and I want to see if anyone wants to share what they learned. Yeah, Lisa.
So, one of the things that emerged through activities that Angela and Kendra presented was awareness that some of what we do is habitual, and we just, it's really a question of having an opportunity to stop and think about how we make decisions versus just making decisions. From that thought, another thing that happened was the keynote, Alexis Stevens, I kind of missed, I don't know if you talked about her at all, but a little bit, mentioned that it's important to not to wait for other people to write, say, legislation that you want to see, to introduce it to solve problems that people have, to wait for somebody else to figure that, to step toward that piece and manifest that piece of action, but to, actually take the action ourselves and say, write a piece of legislation, and then go find shop that piece of legislation, for example, around. And I realized personally I kind of do things that way a little bit, but we do seem to have when people talk about problems that need solving, I do hear a lot of people, and I find myself thinking something has to be done about that, but I don't necessarily think that I have something to do with that. So that was a big takeaway for me, that piece of empowerment. I wanted to mention too, there's an exhibit on Main Street in the Latches Gallery. It was part of the Friday night kickoff on Gallery Walk, it was a project called Imagining Home, and a nurse from Burlington named Allison Cannon decided to apply for a grant from Burlington City Arts and find designers that would talk to homeless people and take that one-on-one relationship and that conversation and create a drawing from the conversation about what would be your next step, what would be the situation you would move into, and it would feel like the right situation to you. So I recommend stopping by and seeing that. It's up all month. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah. Thanks. Someone else, do you want to share?
So my takeaway, kind of piggyback on what Lisa said, and what Angela mentioned earlier about the people who can afford, to buy a tiny house off the lot kind of thing versus taking input from the community or the community that need housing, like a homeless population or population with mental illness. So that was my takeaway. It's the importance of that and how that connects. The decisions that can be made without that input may have more of a negative impact on a larger social issue like homelessness. And it was important to make that connection, to see that connection for me. Oh, sorry. John DiMatteo, the building trades and architecture teacher at the Wyndham Career Center in Brattleboro. Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to share? You don't have to. It was really, I will say, it was really amazing yesterday to see people really open up and be vulnerable and willing to talk about this in a really authentic way. And John and I were talking a little bit. I think it's easy to talk. It's much easier to talk about equity for tiny houses, right? We're looking at a housing system that doesn't want to give tiny houses space, but is going to, because we're here and we're going to make sure there's space for tiny houses, right? Those conversations about zoning, regulations, codes, that is a much easier, and there's like this momentum already there happening. There's a lot that needs to be done, but there's momentum there. The place where we get stuck, it takes a lot more effort and willingness to work through the hard place. And the hard place is the conversation about race and about class and about the disparity that exists in our society today. And some of us have to sit with that. Yesterday it was really palpable through an activity that we did, the sense of guilt that people carried in that activity. And that really is parallel to some of the guilt that we, coming from myself, I come from a middle class background and I married into wealth, and really having to sit with that real feeling of guilt and know that it's there, that it's real, and if I'm going to show up for change, for true equity in the society, I've got to bust through that guilt and that anger, that sadness that I feel, and say, you know what, I'm with you. My friends who have struggled their whole lives and continue to struggle today and probably always will. I am with you, and we're going to work on this together, and I'm not going anywhere, And that's what we really need to do. And so I think I really appreciated yesterday that we were able to have that conversation, and I hope that it continues. Yeah.
Can I share something?
Yeah, please do.
Sure. So I've been working in Philadelphia. There's a gentleman by the name of Paul Glover. Some of you may know who he is. He's a community activist. And 3 times we've done proposals for tiny house villages. The first one was for, and he's associated with the Patch Adams Free Clinic, so we're combining in some urban farming. And the first one was we got an agreement on a 5-acre parcel. Developer was going to let us work with the whole thing. We started working with the community, black community, and there's a real problem with urban farming and black community. There's a certain way they were raised in a way that just doesn't feel right unless they're empowering totally by themselves, and that's not what's happening in a food desert in Philadelphia. It's hard to break through that. So without their support, we couldn't go forward with that. And it's not as developers, this is community development, so it's all at the local level. The next step was the Logan Triangle, 30 acres of houses that were torn down, 1,000 houses. It sat there until this year, and the neighborhood wanted to do it with 300 tiny houses, urban gardens, training centers, all of it integrated, plus a free clinic. And the redevelopment authority took over the property and is giving it to a private developer to be a shopping center. And they will cordon off maybe an acre for alternative something, and that's where that's going. And the final one that will be successful is a black-based community, private community group in West Philadelphia that already got the first permit for a tiny house on wheels for one of their local people who has a roofing problem, and they expect to have about 15 or 20 tiny houses. But again, it's without any gentrification, without any relationship. And so as a group, we all come together to bring that down. They have an urban farm and they already set up. So it's really difficult. The race thing is really relevant when you're in urban settings for what we've been working on. I do something in Iowa and it's not relevant, but in the city it's different where the need is so great.
So can you...
And Paul Glover, you should look up.
Time's up. Our time's up. But
I'm talking at 4:30 over the other place.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Angela.